Hello, Econ 115 students. Welcome to our second chapter, the U.S. economy. Okay, so this is the only things that we like to talk about in this chapter. So let's see. First, we would like to learn how to measure the economy size. Okay, so how to measure the economy size, and then most of the time we'll use gross domestic product (GDP). I bet you have heard this word pretty often. Okay, in the economic news or business news. Then we'll talk about the absolute and relative size of the US economy. We know now the US economy is the largest in the world. Okay, so the absolute size is huge. But how about the relative size? Then we'll move on to talk about why the US economy can produce so much. Why US economy is now the largest in the world. Then we'll move on to talk about how the mix of the US output can change over time and then describe how equally or how unequally incomes are distributed. So the chapter goal for the second one for this chapter will be understand how the US economy, okay, answer the three basic questions. What to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. We will talk about those three questions in details in this chapter. Now let's look at the first one, gross domestic products, GDP. This is a very good indicator for us to measure how big the economic size. So an overall summary of what to produce in the United States is the gross domestic products, GDP. So I hope after today's learning, you know GDP, what those three letters stands for. And then the definition of the GDP, it should be the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a country for a given period of time. So there are several things in those definitions I hope you can pay attention to. First is it should be the market value. It's not the output quality, okay? And then it should be the final goods and services. So what final goods and services mean? If you buy the milk from the grocery store and drink by yourself, or you drink it at the end, then you are the end user of the milk, right? However, if you buy maybe a cup of coffee from Starbucks, okay, and then Starbucks, they will, it's not a coffee. I said probably you will buy their latte, okay, from Starbucks. They will put the milk into the coffee and then to make the latte. The milk that put it in the coffee is the intermediate good because you were not using the milk directly, right? Is the Starbucks use the milk and then create the final product that will be latte. So GDP only counts the market value of all the final goods and services. So for example, there is another example like the phone, okay, the smartphone. You buy the smartphone, you don't need extra to pay the chips because chips are the components of the smartphone. Smartphone is the final goods, right? So GDP counts all the market value of the final goods and services produced within a country. It should be within a country boundaries. So no matter your nationalities, if there is a Canadians, okay, who live in the United States and then working in the United States, his salary, his earning, his income were counted in the US GDP, not Canada's GDP. Okay? So in a given period of time, GDP will always report it quarterly or annually. Now, here is how we compute the market value. We just use the price times quality. And then let's look at two measurements of the output. One measurement of the output will be what we call a nominal GDP, okay, NGDP. So nominal GDP will just use the output times the current price. Okay, so output times the current price. And then another one will be real GDP. So real GDP will use the output multiply the constant prices. I will show how to compute nominal GDP and real GDP later. So you can see real GDP will just use the constant price, which means real GDP already adjusted for inflation. And only real GDP can be used to compare outputs from one year to another. Doubling the price can doubling the nominal GDP, but not the real GDP. Okay, so the value of the output changes significantly if it measures in current price or constant prices. So we can see there's an example. Okay, real GDP we know is already adjusted for inflation, but why? So let's look at this table. Okay, so this table, the first column shows the production. Okay, products including orange, razors, and the video games. Okay, so there are three products. And then it also gives you the quantity. Quantity is the exactly outputs, right? So the outputs for orange, the outputs for razor, and then the outputs for video games. Okay, so let me just write it down. I use O to represent for O here represents orange, right? And then R here represents for razor, and then I will use V to represent for video games. Okay, so I put a quantity here. Quantity, I just use Q to represent. Okay, so let's see. The quantity will be 6, 1, and 0.7. Okay, okay, 0.07. The 6 oranges. Okay, impedance. Okay, so 6, 1, 6, 3, sorry, and 0.07. Okay, so those are in billions. Now let's see the price. So it has the price in different years. It has the price in different years. We have year one, okay, and we have the price in year two. So in year one, the price for orange, okay, will be 0.2, 20 cents. Okay, so 0.2. And then for razor will be 0.3. And then for video games will be $30. Okay, those are the price. And then in year two, we notice the price all double. Okay, 0.4, 40 cents, 60 cents, and $60. Okay, so if we just compute the nominal GDP in year two, okay, so let me see the nominal GDP in year two. We will just use year two's price, right? We'll just use those are year two price, right? The current price times the current quantity, okay, times the quantity, the outputs. So what we can use is $0.4 times 6 plus 0.60 cents, okay, times 3, and then also plus $60 times 0.07. So this will give you the nominal GDP. This is 2.4 plus 1.8 plus 4.2. So that will give you the result here will equal $8.4, right? Yes, it give you the nominal GDP in year two will equal $8.4. Okay, so it's actually 8.4 billions. Okay, now let's look at the real GDP. Real GDP in year two. How you can compute a real GDP? Real GDP will help you to use the base year price. So this year one will be the base year, right? Times the quantity in year two, okay? So base year price, we will have 20 cents for orange price, 30 cents for razor's price, and then $30 for video games price, okay? So finally, here we will have 1.2 plus 0.9 plus 2.1. So there will be 4.2. So you can see here based on our calculations. In year two, okay, the output 6 billions of the oranges, 3 billions of the reserves and 0.07 billions of the video games. If we just use the nominal GDP, use the current price, we will have the nominal GDP equal 8.4, right? Equal 8.4. However, if we use the base year price, then the real GDP is just 4.2. You can see double the price here compared with this price, okay? Double the price can just double the nominal GDP, but not real GDP. And this is why we say the real GDP already adjusted for inflation. All right, let's look at 2018's international comparisons between different countries. Okay, you can notice that US, the GDP in United States in 2018 will be as high as more than $19 trillion. Okay, followed by China more than like a $12 trillion, and then by Japan, Germany, etc. Okay, so if we just consider the absolute value of the absolute size of the U.S. economy, it is super large. Okay, it's huge. However, let's look at another way to compare with the relative size of the U.S. economy. We know that population varies, right? In some countries, they have very few populations, but in some countries, the populations are huge, like China, like India, right? So because the population varies, there is another useful measure of economic size that will be per capita GDP. So per capita GDP here indicates how much the output each person could get if all the outputs were divided equally among the populations. So how we can get the per capita GDP? Per capita GDP will actually just equal the GDP divides the total population. Okay, so GDP divide the total population will be the way that we compute per capita GDP. Okay, so this is the formula to compute a per capita GDP. Total population, total GDP divide the total population. And that you can see still in 2018, okay? If you used the total GDP divide the total population to get a per capita GDP, now US is no longer the first one, right? But still on the top tier. So you can see now the US, the per capita GDP reached as higher as nearly 50, I can say it's nearly $60,000. Okay, this will be our per capita GDP. And the world average is just like $10,000, right? And then you can see if you move on to talk to check China. Before we know that in 2018, China ranked the second part, right? No, the second place. Sorry, China ranked the second place in the GDP, right? Just smaller than United States. But if you use the per capita GDP, actually the per capita GDP in China was pretty small. It's just as smaller as like 50, less than, let's see, less than $9,000 per year, okay, for each person. So this is another way that we can compare with the economic size. If we just consider absolute size, we can use total GDP. If we want to use the relative size, we can switch to use per capita GDP. Okay, now let's look at some historical comparisons. Before 2019, we know that the US real GDP increased by about 3% per year. Okay, so causing a persistent economic growth. You might think about 3% is a very small number, right? However, you can think about how large the US economy will be, like nearly $20 trillion or more than $19 trillion. So 3% is actually a huge number, okay, a huge increase. However, during the pandemic, we can see that in 2019, okay, the economic growth, the real GDP, 2.3%. However, in 2020, we have negative GDP growth rate, negative 2.8%, but it bumped dramatically in 2021, like increase real GDP, an annual increase 5.9%, and then last year will be 2.1%. So economic growth permits the higher standards of living and social welfare for many, and GDP is the single best measurement of the nation's economic well-being. Although we know that GDP is not a perfect indicator, but it's still, sorry, although we know it's not a perfect indicator, it is still one of the best measurement. And then more outputs will improve definitely social welfare. Now let's look at the mix of the outputs. So we know that the constant of the output can be measured by the end. Sorry, not the constant, the content. Okay, the content of the output can be measured by end use. So let's see, for GDP, we actually have four components, okay? Consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So consumption will be just measuring the consumptions by households. You can consume the durable goods like their house appliances, right? You can also consume like durable goods such as cars and non-durable goods like the food. And then we also have the second component will be investment. So this investment will be more related to business investment. It's not like the financial investment in the stock market or bonds market. Okay. So here investment means the investment in new product, new equipment or inventories. And then we also talk about the government spending will be another important part of GDP. And government spending have three layers, okay? Federal level, state level, local level. And then next part, the last part will be net exports. So net export here, net exports, okay, will equal export subtract imports, okay? And let's see, now in the United States, the biggest component of GDP comes from consumption, okay? Comes from consumption, followed by government spending and the investment. And then you can see our net exports actually is negative. Negative means that we import. So if it's negative, and then that means the imports more than exports, okay? So United States imports more goods and services rather than imports the market value, okay, of goods and services more than the exports. So we can see here from this graph, the biggest slice of the U.S. economy is consumption. However, through past 150 years, there is a structural changes to the U.S. economy. You can see the first one will be the substantial technological progress, including in agriculture and manufacturing. And then we also noticed that employment shift to service as well, especially from agriculture to manufacturing and then from manufacturing to service. We also can see the expansion of the international trade. So now this net exports, even is still negative, okay, in United States economy, but we can see it also expand because of the global economics. And now you can see those are the two different graph or two different pie chart showing the economic composition, like in 1900 and in 2020. Okay, so in 2000, you can see in 1900, the most majority of the GDP comes from which part comes from agriculture, right? But and then it will followed by, let me see, okay, it will follow by the manufacturing and then the others. But now you will see things changes a lot. Service now takes the most part for the US GDP, right? And then look at the agriculture. The agriculture shrink dramatically through the past 100 years. And now let's look at the second question, how American produce. So how the United States produce goods and services has changed also over time, and the US has an abundant of factors of production which determine production possibility. Do you still remember factors of production? This is the concept that we introduced in chapter 1, right? Including land, labor force, capital, and entrepreneurship, right? And we know that increasing international trade also expands the US production possibility. Ability to change production process is directly related to factor mobility. So we will see those factor mobility as well. First, let's look at the capital stock. We know that the US has the largest GDP in the world. Okay, because of it can be substantially produced because of the higher educated workers in the capital intensive production process. If you check those factories in United States and the factories in the developing countries or undeveloped countries, totally different. Here we mostly capital intensive, okay? And then in developing countries or undeveloped countries, they almost labor intensive. So capital intensive production process requires a high ratio of capital to labor inputs, which means now most of our factories will be automatic automations, okay, rather than just use human beings. Let's look at the second one, private sector. So the factors of productions are organized and reallocated by business. For example, we have three different type of their business. The first one will be corporations. So corporations are owned by many individuals. And then we have the partnerships. So partnerships are owned by a small number of individuals. And then the last one will be what we call the proprietorships. Business owned by only one individual. Okay, so we have three different type of their entrepreneurship. Okay, different type of their business. You can see that if we just consider the number of the firms, if we just consider the number of the firms, okay, that will be the first pie chart. Which entrepreneurship will take the majority? For the business only owned by one individual, right? They are take those business that actually takes majority of the numbers. However, if we're referring to the share of the total sales, the second pie chart, we can see corporation now dominant in this part, right? And then also if we talk about the total assets, then corporations dominance again, okay? Dominance again. So this is what we see, the different changes, the different allocation of resources within these three type of the business. For the US, let's talk about the government role. Okay, so the government plays a large role in deciding what, how, and for whom goods are distributed. Okay, so we can see the government can providing the legal framework, can also protect the consumers, also protect the laborers, and then protecting the environment. Okay, so those are some major roles the government will always play. Okay, try to protect the consumers, protect the labor force, protect the environment, and also providing the legal framework. Thus, the government lays the foundations for market transactions by establish and ring and enforcing ownership rights. This is very important. Okay, consumer rights. So ownership rights can help to set up the legal framework for business, right? And then protect consumers through the contract rights or like the employees, okay, the workers through the contract rights. And also like the other rules of the game, such as set out the regulations for the distribution of the pollution like things, right? So those are the things that government can do and prevents business from becoming too powerful and to regulate the safety of the products. This is also important. If there is only one company that can, let's say, the monopoly, okay, so that company will has a definite absolute power to define the to decide the price, right? Then in order to avoid those business become too powerful in the price decision, the government also has their own labor, sorry, or the government has their own legal framework to, such as the antitrust policies. Okay, and we also know that the government will establish the labor laws regarding to when you are illegal to enter the workforce. We will not hire the people that lower than 40 years old, like 14 years old, right? And then there are workplace safety. Okay, that's also important. Number of the hours per week want to work. Okay, so for example, per week we will not encourage or 40 hours will be the maximum. And then what about the benefits and compensation to those workforce? Now, government established regulations that limits air, waters, and noise pollutions, right? Try to protect the environment. In addition, it also regulates the use of land and natural resources. Because we know from the first chapter, resources are limited, right? So the final question is how those resources are distributed or how those production, those outputs are distributed. In a market economy, we know that individuals' income will depending on quantity and the quality of the resources owned and then the price of those resources command. So we know that in a command economy, then the government will decide an individual's allocation. Let's look at the biggest slide of the US economy to the richest fifth of the population. You can see that the richest fifth of the population actually takes 51.4%. Okay, and then we will also have the second fifth takes the 23%. The poorest takes 3.1% in the whole society's population. And as countries develop, the personal distribution of income tends to become more equal. Okay, the personal distribution of income is the way that total income is divided among the households or the income classes. And while we know the richest people, okay, have the largest, biggest income, their compensation changes also over time. Permanent inequality is more the exception than the rule that the U.S. economy. We can see that actually most of people might notice that the income distribution kind of like unfair, right? Is not equal. But the government can do something, okay, to redistribute the income. And then when they, what type of the policies they will always use to redistribute income? Collecting tax, right? Collecting tax and then to redistribute the income to the low income people. So we can see others, often people will feel like income distributed unfair, right? And then this is what I just talked about. Government can redistribute income through the tax collected and transfers. And this is one tax rate that government use currently. Progressive tax sets the tax rate higher as income increases. So you can see the federal income tax is designed to be progressive, which means if your income increase into some categories, okay, then your tax rate will be higher than others. So government can transfer the tax revenue to the pool. You might notice that in the U.S. the biggest transfer comes from the social security part. And then in United States, the poorest residents, okay, even have the higher standards than 3 billion inhabitants of the earth who live just maybe $3 per day. So even the poorest people in the United States have higher living standard than 3 billion populations in the earth. So in September 2000, the United Nations adopted the minimum of okay for to reduce the global poverty over 15 years, and then after 2015, it also extended for another 15 years. So if you just think about it will maybe lend money to those poorest country and then to help them to develop, that is not enough. Okay, they need not only money, they also need technology. They need educations. So there has been some success, but only one persistent economic growth can end the global poverty. Now, let's just summarize for this chapter. Okay, so this chapter actually mainly focus on the U.S. economy, right? And then for U.S. economy, we introduce GDP to measure the market size. And then we also talk about GDP in two different measurements, right? Nominal GDP and real GDP. So real GDP already adjusted for inflation, but nominal GDP is not. And then we also would like to talk. We also talk about how the U.S. can produce so much, and then how U.S. distributes the income or how U.S. distributes the output. We know currently it seems not fair. Most people might feel that okay, the richest people maybe have the biggest part of the income. However, government will still adopt some policies, okay, try to redistribute the income and then to make it become more equal. Okay, so this is what we learned in this chapter. Thank you so much.